Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Science Channel. Tonight, we'll be looking inward into the vast and beautiful expanse of human connection, a place filled with understanding, with compassion, and endless possibilities for genuine meeting. Within each of us exists something remarkable, the capacity to feel another's pain as though it were our own, to celebrate another's joy as though it were our triumph. But there is so much more than what meets the eye. Some of the empathy we offer has already touched lives long before we fully realize it. A simple gesture of kindness may be reshaping an entire world millions of moments away. And the quiet moment of someone truly listening may be something far more powerful than a grain of sand. The human heart is both ordinary and spectacular, something we carry with us every day. Yet it never ceases to transform those around us. If you enjoy these quiet explorations of what connects us, I invite you to sit with these words, to share them with someone who might need them, or simply to rest in them. It helps others find their way here too, one compassionate soul at a time. But for now, all you need to do is settle in, breathe deeply, and allow the understanding of connection to carry you. Let's begin. Every act of empathy ripples outward through time and space. When you pause to truly listen to another person's struggle, you set something in motion that extends far beyond that single conversation. Empathy is not merely a private feeling, it is a force that moves through the world in ways we rarely comprehend. The moment you choose to see another's pain, to acknowledge their experience as valid and real, you activate a chain reaction of healing that touches not just that person, but everyone they encounter afterward. Consider the parent who holds their crying child with full presence, asking what hurts, and truly hearing the answer. That child learns in that moment that their inner world matters, that they can be understood. Years later, as an adult, this person will pass that gift forward. They will listen to their own child, their friend, their colleague, their stranger on the street with a quality of attention that can only come from having once been truly heard. The empathy that began with one parent has now reached into the future, shaping lives not yet born. A teacher who notices a student withdrawing in class asks a gentle question during lunch. Instead of reporting a behavior problem, she creates space for the student to share what's happening at home. That student, once seen and supported, learns that adults can be trusted with vulnerability. They learn that difficult feelings don't have to be faced alone. 20 years later, when that student becomes a teacher themselves, or a parent, or simply a friend, they will create that same sacred space for others. The empathy travels forward through time, multiplying with each passing it receives. The neural pathways of empathy are strengthened each time we practice them. Scientists have discovered that our brains are designed to resonate with the experiences of others. Within our neurons live mirror neurons, cells that fire both when we perform an action and when we witness someone else performing that action. This isn't metaphorical. There is actual physical correspondence between observer and observed. When you truly empathize with someone, your brain literally mirrors their experience. Your neural patterns align with theirs. In this moment of alignment, something real happens. You are not simply imagining their experience. You are, in a very real sense, sharing it. This neural mirroring is why trauma can be transmitted across generations and why healing can be too. A grandmother who never processed her grief may pass down an unspoken emotional weight to her daughter, who passes it to her grandchild. But the reverse is equally true. A person who does the work of healing and integration can transmit that same capacity for wholeness forward. The empathy, encoded in their nervous system, becomes available to others through proximity, through witness, through the simple fact of being known by someone who has done their own work. The invisible scaffolding of human connection. We are not isolated islands of consciousness, though modern life often teaches us to feel that way. Every single interaction we have leaves traces on both ourselves and others. These traces are invisible to the eye, but they are undeniably present. They shape who we become, how we see ourselves, and what we believe is possible in relationship. Think of the barista who remembers your order, who asks how your day has been and actually waits for an answer. This person is not required to do this. They could mechanically take orders and hand over drinks, but instead, they practice small empathy. And in that practice, several things happen simultaneously. The customer feels seen, feels that their existence matters enough to be remembered. The barista reinforces their own capacity for attention and care, and both leave that interaction slightly different than they entered it. The customer may treat the next person they encounter with more kindness, inspired by having been treated with kindness. The barista may feel more connected to their work, their life, their sense of purpose. This is the invisible scaffolding that holds human civilization together. It is not written in laws or enforced by authorities. It is maintained through thousands of small choices, made in thousands of moments, to pay attention to the people around us. When this scaffolding is strong, when people generally treat each other with care and attention, entire communities thrive. Crime decreases, health improves, people take better care of their environment, children develop more securely. Not because of grand gestures, but because of the accumulated weight of small empathic acts, choosing day after day to honor the humanity in others. Conversely, when this scaffolding weakens, when empathy breaks down, when people begin to see each other as obstacles or objects, rather than as conscious beings with their own inner lives, entire societies fracture. Violence increases. People become defensive and mistrustful. The breakdown of empathy on a large scale creates the conditions for atrocity. History shows us repeatedly that dehumanization, the withdrawal of empathy, always precedes cruelty. This is why maintaining our capacity for empathy is not a luxury or a nice add-on to civilization. It is foundational. It is the bedrock upon which everything else is built. The capacity for empathy is not evenly distributed at birth. Some people seem naturally drawn toward understanding others. They ask questions before making judgments. They notice when someone is hurting, even when that person is trying to hide it. They feel the distress of animals, of strangers, sometimes even of people they disagree with or dislike. But not everyone possesses this capacity equally. And this is not because some people are inherently better or worse. It is because empathy, like any neural capacity, develops through practice, through modeling, and through the conditions of one's early environment. Children who grow up in environments where their own feelings are honored and understood develop more robust, empathic capacities. Their parents ask, "How did that make you feel?" and listen for real answers. Their caregivers help them name emotions and understand that all feelings are valid, even as not all behaviors are acceptable. These children learn to recognize the inner lives of others because adults consistently reflected back their own inner life to them. They learned that consciousness matters because theirs was treated as though it mattered. Children who grow up in chaotic or neglectful environments often struggle with empathy, not because they are defective, but because their brains adapted to survival mode. When you are focused on predicting and managing the moods of an unpredictable caregiver, you develop a different kind of attentional skill set. You become hypervigilant to threats, but you may not develop the same capacity for genuine curiosity about others' inner lives that comes from secure attachment. You may become skilled at reading people superficially, at knowing how to get what you need or avoid punishment. But deeper empathy requires a kind of safety that wasn't available. This is why trauma-informed practice has become so important in education, mental health, and social work. We now understand that many of the behaviors we labeled as lack of empathy or psychopathic tendencies, are actually adaptive responses to environments that did not provide the conditions for empathy to develop. A child who never learned to regulate their own nervous system because no one helped them do so cannot easily help regulate someone else's. A person who learned that vulnerability is dangerous cannot easily open to the vulnerability of others. But here is the profound truth. Empathy can be learned and relearned at any age. The brain maintains plasticity throughout our lives. The neural pathways can be rewired. A person who grew up with minimal empathic attunement can, through conscious practice, through therapy, through relationship, through repeated experiences of being truly understood, begin to develop the capacity to truly understand others. It is harder than if it had been laid down early, like learning a language you didn't learn as a child. But it is possible. This means that no one is locked into a permanent deficit. We are all capable of growth in our capacity for empathy. The courage required to truly empathize, genuine empathy, is not a soft or passive thing. It requires tremendous courage. To truly empathize with another person's suffering is to allow that suffering to affect you. It means you cannot maintain comfortable distance. You cannot remain uninvolved. You must care. And caring exposes you to pain. If you truly understand what it is like to be bullied, you cannot be comfortable when you witness bullying, even bullying you're not directly involved in. If you truly empathize with the experience of poverty, you cannot enjoy your abundance without some measure of discomfort about the inequality. If you understand what grief feels like, you cannot encounter someone's loss without being touched by it. Empathy demands something of us. It asks us to feel more than we might otherwise feel, to care more than we might otherwise care, to be moved by things that don't directly affect us. This is why empathy can be taxing. This is why people who work in caring professions, nurses, teachers, social workers, therapists, often experience burnout. They have opened their hearts to the suffering of others, and without sufficient support and restoration, that opening can deplete them. Their own nervous systems become dysregulated from holding so much pain that isn't theirs to solve. This is why self-care is not selfish for people in these roles. Replenishing their own emotional resources allows them to continue offering empathy without becoming empty. But here is the paradox. While empathy can be taxing, it is also fundamentally restorative. Studies show that people who engage in acts of kindness and compassion report greater life satisfaction, better mental health, and stronger immune function. When we empathize with another and offer support, we activate the parasympathetic nervous system, the part of us that promotes healing and connection. We feel better. Our bodies feel better. The engagement of empathy is not only good for the person receiving it, it is good for the person offering it. This means that empathy is not a sacrifice we make despite its cost. It is something that sustains us, that gives our lives meaning, that connects us to something larger than our individual survival. The person who opens their heart to the suffering of others is not losing something precious. They are gaining access to what makes life worth living: genuine connection, shared meaning, the knowledge that we are not alone in the human experience. When empathy fails, understanding often follows. One of the most common failures of empathy occurs not because people are cruel, but because they cannot imagine an experience radically different from their own. A person who has never experienced discrimination cannot easily empathize with the accumulated weight of being constantly treated as less than. A person who has never worried about basic security cannot easily understand the constant low-level fear of someone living in poverty. A person who has always belonged cannot easily understand the specific pain of not belonging. This is why education and exposure are so important. When we learn the actual experiences of people whose lives are different from ours, not through stereotypes or generalizations, but through real stories, through real relationships, Through deep listening, our capacity for empathy expands. A person might intellectually understand that racism is wrong, but that intellectual understanding transforms when they become friends with someone who experiences racism daily and hear, in their friend's own words, what that is actually like. The empathy moves from abstract to visceral. This is why literature and storytelling are not luxuries or entertainments. They are essential infrastructure for developing human empathy. When you read a novel set in a culture different from your own, when you inhabit the consciousness of a character whose life is radically different from yours, you are actually developing empathy. Your brain is practicing what it is like to be that person. This is why people who read fiction tend to score higher on tests of empathy and theory of mind, the ability to understand that other people have inner lives separate from our own. Fiction is empathy training. Similarly, travel, when it involves genuine encounter rather than tourism, expands empathy. When you spend time in a place, when you learn the history and current realities of a place, when you interact with its people not as exotic others but as fellow humans navigating their own lives, your sense of connection to the world expands. You realize that people everywhere are trying to take care of their families, are dealing with hardship and joy, are trying to make sense of their lives and pass down wisdom to the next generation. You realize that what unites us is far larger than what divides us. But perhaps the most powerful expansion of empathy comes through personal crisis. When you experience something that strips away your assumptions about how the world works, you often become more empathic. Someone who has never experienced serious illness often becomes deeply empathic toward illness when they or someone they love becomes seriously ill. Someone who has never struggled financially becomes more empathic toward financial struggle when they experience it. Someone who has never felt despair becomes more empathic toward despair when depression arrives at their door. This is not to suggest that we need to experience every form of suffering to empathize with it, but there is often a deepening of empathy that comes when our own assumptions about our invulnerability are shattered. We become more humble about life's fragility. We become more aware that what happened to someone else could happen to us. And from that awareness, real empathy can grow. The neural biology of shared experience. Recent advances in neuroscience have given us unprecedented insight into the physical reality of empathy. We now understand that when we empathize with another person, specific patterns of neural activation occur in our brains. The anterior insula, which processes emotional information, activates. The anterior cingulate cortex, which helps us understand the mental states of others, activates. These aren't metaphorical activations. They are actual physical events happening in actual neural tissue. This is why empathy is sometimes called emotional resonance. Your nervous system is literally resonating with another's nervous system. This can happen through a look, through presence, through listening. It doesn't require words. A parent holding a baby activates these same neural networks. An old friend sitting with you during grief activates these networks. A stranger noticing you're struggling and offering help activates these networks. In each case, something real is happening in your brain. You are not imagining the connection. The connection is physically present. This also explains why loneliness is so physically damaging. Humans are not designed to be isolated. Our nervous systems are designed to resonate with other nervous systems. When we lack these connections, when we lack the experience of being truly understood by others, our brains suffer. Chronic loneliness is now understood to be as dangerous to physical health as smoking or obesity. It damages the immune system, increases inflammation, and predicts early death. The isolation itself is not just emotionally painful, it is physically harmful. Conversely, connection heals. This is why support groups work. why therapy works, why community matters. When our nervous systems have the experience of being in resonance with other nervous systems, of being truly heard, truly seen, truly understood, it changes us. Physically, our nervous systems recalibrate. Our stress hormones decrease. Our immune function improves. We quite literally heal. This is not mysterious or spiritual, though it can feel that way. It is neurobiology. Our brains developed in an environment where we were always in groups, where survival depended on being understood by and connected to others. Our nervous systems are wired for this. We are designed to be affected by each other. This is why emotional contagion is real. Why you can walk into a room where people are anxious and feel your own anxiety rise, or walk into a room where people are calm and feel yourself settling. Your brain is designed to synchronize with the emotional states of those around you. The development of moral imagination through empathy. One of the most important capacities that empathy develops is what we might call moral imagination, the ability to imagine states of affairs different from what currently exists, and to understand what changes would be necessary to bring them about. Moral imagination requires empathy because it requires you to genuinely care about the experiences of people you're not directly connected to, people you'll never meet, people whose lives are radically different from your own. Throughout history, expansions of moral circles, the group of people toward whom we extend moral consideration, have always been preceded by expansions of empathy. The abolition of slavery became possible not just because the economics of slavery became unfavorable, but because people developed genuine empathy for enslaved people. They listened to first-hand accounts. They imagined what it would be like to have your body owned by another person, to have your children taken from you. As this empathy spread, it became unconscionable to maintain slavery. This empathy didn't single-handedly end slavery. Material conditions mattered. Resistance from enslaved people mattered. But without the expansion of empathy, the political will to abolish slavery would not have existed. Similarly, the development of human rights as a concept required empathy. It required people to recognize that all humans, regardless of the group they were born into, deserved certain basic considerations and protections. This recognition had to be felt in people's hearts before it could be codified in law. It required empathy. Today, we face similar moral questions. Should we extend moral consideration to animals beyond those we've traditionally domesticated? Do we have obligations to future generations who will live with the climate we're creating? What do we owe to people whose suffering is caused by systems we benefit from? These questions cannot be answered through pure logic or economics. They require empathy, genuine imagination of, and concern for the experiences of those affected. Without empathy, these questions remain abstract. With empathy, they become urgent. This is why empathy is not just a personal virtue. It is essential for the functioning of just societies. Without empathy, we cannot imagine a world different from the one we currently inhabit. Without empathy, we cannot motivate ourselves to make changes that might benefit others at some cost to ourselves. Empathy is the engine that drives moral progress, even when that progress is slow and incomplete. The paradox of empathy: it cannot be forced. One of the most important truths about empathy is that it cannot be forced or manufactured. You cannot shame someone into empathy. You cannot argue someone into empathy. Empathy arises from within. It arises when conditions are right for it to arise. And yet, conditions can be created that make empathy more likely. When someone is in a defensive stance, their nervous system in fight or flight mode, empathy becomes very difficult. The person is focused on self-protection. They don't have access to the parts of their brain that enable genuine understanding of others. This is why empathy often breaks down in environments of conflict. When people feel attacked or threatened, they retreat into us versus them thinking. Their empathic capacity narrows to those in their own group and disappears for those they perceive as threats. This means that to cultivate empathy, we first need to create safety. When people feel secure, when their basic needs are met, when they don't feel constantly under threat, empathy naturally emerges. This is why the first response to conflict shouldn't always be to demand more empathy. Sometimes what's needed first is to address the conditions that are making empathy impossible, to reduce the threat, to meet the person where they are, to create enough safety that their nervous system can relax enough to actually feel connection to others. This is why understanding trauma is important for understanding empathy. People who have experienced severe trauma often struggle with empathy, not because they are broken people, but because their nervous systems learn to prioritize vigilance and self-protection. Before they can empathize with the experiences of others, they often need to experience enough safety and healing that their own nervous systems can settle. And then, often very gradually, empathy begins to return. This is also why self-compassion is foundational to empathy toward others. You cannot genuinely empathize with someone else's pain while simultaneously being harsh and judgmental toward your own pain. If you've learned to deny or suppress your own difficult feelings, you will have difficulty recognizing and honoring those same feelings in others. The capacity to be gentle with yourself is the same capacity that you extend to others. They develop together. This is why empathy cannot be a performance or a manipulation. If you're pretending to empathize in order to get something from someone, that person will feel the falseness. Real empathy cannot be faked. It requires genuine openness, genuine curiosity, genuine care. And these things cannot be manufactured on demand, but they can be cultivated. They can be practiced. They can be strengthened through repeated engagement. The ways empathy can be distorted. While empathy itself is generally a force for good, empathy can be distorted and used in harmful ways. Understanding these distortions is important because it allows us to distinguish between genuine empathy and its counterfeits. One common distortion is what we might call empathic enmeshment. This occurs when someone empathizes so completely with another person's experience that they lose the ability to maintain appropriate boundaries or to recognize their own needs. A parent might become so focused on empathizing with their child's distress that they rescue the child from every uncomfortable feeling, preventing the child from developing resilience. A therapist might become so empathically engaged with a client that they begin treating the therapy as a personal friendship, crossing professional boundaries. In these cases, empathy becomes a vehicle for the empathizer's own needs, rather than a genuine offering to the other person. Another distortion is selective empathy. This occurs when people extend empathy toward those they perceive as similar to themselves, while withdrawing it from those they perceive as different. We might feel genuine empathy for people in our own community or country, while feeling nothing for people in other parts of the world, even when those people are suffering far more. We might empathize with people who share our political beliefs, while refusing to empathize with those who disagree with us. This selective empathy can feel like genuine empathy, because the feeling part is real. But it is empathy used in service of group identity, rather than in service of genuine connection to the full spectrum of human experience. A third distortion is what we might call empathy as manipulation. This occurs when someone uses their understanding of another person's inner life and vulnerabilities to manipulate them. An abuser often has very accurate empathic understanding of their victim. They know exactly what to say to hurt them, how to make them feel responsible for the abuser's feelings, how to create dependency. They have empathic insight. but they are using it as a weapon rather than as a means of connection. This is why extremely accurate empathic understanding, combined with intent to harm, is one of the most dangerous combinations in human psychology. A fourth distortion is what we might call performative empathy. This occurs in social contexts where empathy becomes something to display rather than something to practice. People speak the language of empathy. "I feel you. That's so hard," etc., without genuine engagement. This can happen on social media, where displays of compassion for trending causes become a way to signal virtue rather than a genuine expression of care. Performative empathy keeps us feeling like we're engaged with the world's suffering without actually requiring change on our part. These distortions remind us that empathy is not automatically virtuous. Like any powerful human capacity, it can be used well or poorly. But recognizing these distortions doesn't mean we should give up on empathy. It means we should practice genuine empathy with awareness, with boundaries, with attention to whether our empathy is actually serving connection and healing, or whether it's being distorted in service of other agendas. The surprising truth about disagreement and empathy. One of the most counterintuitive discoveries about empathy is that you can genuinely empathize with someone's experience and worldview, while simultaneously disagreeing with their conclusions or values. In fact, the most sophisticated empathy often requires this dual capacity. Consider a complex political disagreement. You can genuinely empathize with someone whose political views are radically different from yours. You can understand the experiences that have shaped their views. You can recognize that, given their particular history, their particular environment, their particular values, their position makes sense. But you can also, simultaneously, believe their position is wrong or harmful. Empathy and disagreement are not mutually exclusive. In fact, genuine empathy often makes disagreement more productive rather than less. When you have actually empathized with someone's perspective, when you have genuinely tried to understand the logic and feeling behind it, your critiques of that perspective become more sophisticated and more likely to actually land. You're not arguing against a caricature of their position. You're arguing against their actual position, which you've taken the time to really understand. And they're more likely to listen to your disagreement when they feel that you've genuinely tried to understand them first. This is why the question, "Can you help me understand how you came to that conclusion?" is so much more powerful than, "You're wrong, and here's why." The first question extends empathy. It creates space for genuine dialogue. The second question closes dialogue. It puts the other person on the defensive. Their nervous system shifts into fight mode, and the possibility of genuine understanding and potentially of movement often disappears. This capacity to empathize while maintaining disagreement is particularly important as we face increasingly polarized times. We need the ability to genuinely understand those who see the world very differently than we do. We need to know what experiences have shaped them, what fears underlie their positions, what values they're trying to protect. This doesn't mean accepting their positions as valid. It means extending empathy to the person, even while disagreeing with the position. It means recognizing our common humanity, even in the midst of deep disagreement. The role of empathy in healing collective trauma. Just as empathy plays a role in healing individual trauma, it plays an equally important role in healing collective trauma. Collective trauma occurs when groups of people have experienced shared suffering, colonization, genocide, slavery, war, persecution. This trauma doesn't just affect individuals. It becomes encoded in the culture, passed down through families, embedded in institutional structures. The healing of collective trauma requires several elements, and empathy is one of the most crucial. It requires that the perpetrating group develops genuine empathy for what the harmed group has experienced, not guilt or shame that centers the perpetrator's experience, but real, visceral empathy for the specific suffering that was inflicted. This empathy must be genuine enough that it motivates change. Change in how systems operate, change in how history is taught, change in how resources are distributed. It also requires that the harmed group is witnessed in their pain, that their experience is not minimized or reframed, that the full weight and reality of what happened to them is acknowledged and held. This witnessing itself is healing. Trauma often involves a kind of isolation. The experience was so extreme that no one could possibly understand. To be witnessed, to have your experience reflected back to you as real and significant by others, begins to break that isolation. The healing of collective trauma also requires something from the harmed group themselves. Not a requirement to forgive, but a possibility of eventually moving toward futures that are not entirely defined by the trauma. This doesn't mean forgetting or minimizing. It means developing the capacity to hold both the reality of what happened and the possibility of a different future. And this capacity is often supported by empathy from others, including sometimes from members of groups that were complicit in causing the harm. History shows us that when this empathic healing work is not done, the trauma persists. It gets passed down. It continues to poison relationships. It continues to generate cycles of harm. But we also have examples of societies that have done this work, where truth commissions have allowed traumatized people to be heard, where genuine apologies have been offered and accepted, where structural changes have attempted to address the roots of injustice. These efforts, while often imperfect, demonstrate that empathic healing on a collective level is possible. The invisible work of empathic listening. One of the most underestimated forms of empathy is the simple act of listening. Not listening to respond, not listening while planning what you'll say next, but genuine listening. Listening where you are fully present with another person, holding space for them to express themselves fully, without judgment, without agenda. This kind of listening is harder than it might appear. Our brains are constantly generating predictions about what we're about to hear. Our attention is frequently pulled to our own thoughts and reactions. We often listen not to understand, but to confirm what we already believe, to find ammunition for our own position, to wait for our turn to speak. Genuine listening requires us to quiet all of this, to let our brains be surprised by what we hear, to follow the other person's meaning rather than imposing our own. When someone receives this quality of listening, something shifts inside them. Often, they begin to clarify their own thinking. They begin to understand themselves better. Issues that seemed confusing start to make sense. They feel seen, understood, held. And this experience is itself healing. It confirms that they exist, that they matter, that their inner world is worth attention. Empathic listening is particularly powerful in the context of loss or difficulty. Someone experiencing grief doesn't need advice about how to get over it. They need to be heard. They need someone to sit with them in the reality of their loss. They need someone to understand that what they're experiencing is normal, is valid, is something that many have experienced before. This understanding, offered through listening, is more healing than almost anything else. Yet in our modern world, this kind of listening has become increasingly rare. We are constantly distracted. We are trained to multitask, to remain productive, to move on to the next thing. Deep listening feels like a luxury rather than a necessity. But the absence of deep listening is creating epidemics of loneliness and isolation. People are not being heard. They are not being seen. They are surrounded by others yet profoundly alone. Creating space for empathic listening is one of the most important things we can do, both for others and for ourselves. When we listen to others with full presence, we practice empathy. We develop the neural networks of understanding and connection, and we experience the profound satisfaction of genuine human contact. The person speaking feels less alone. The person listening feels more alive. Both are changed by the encounter. The way empathy connects us. Across time, empathy is not limited to present encounters. We can empathize with people who lived in the past. We can empathize with people we will never meet, who will live in the future. This capacity to empathize across time is uniquely human and uniquely powerful. When we study history and genuinely empathize with people who lived in different eras, we gain wisdom. We understand how people made sense of their world, given the information and constraints they operated under. We see how historical events that seemed inevitable at the time were actually contingent, the result of specific choices, specific accidents, specific moments when things could have gone differently. And we recognize that the same is true for our own time. The futures we fear or hope for are not predetermined. They will be shaped by the choices we make today. We can empathize with future generations. We can imagine what it would be like to live in a world that is significantly warmer, that has experienced major species extinction, that has undergone massive climate migration. We can feel, in our bodies, what it would be like to inherit a world significantly damaged by our choices. And this empathy, if it's genuine rather than performative, can motivate us to make different choices now. We can recognize that the future people who will inhabit the world are real people with real inner lives, with hopes and dreams as valid as our own. They are not abstractions. They deserve moral consideration just as much as people living now. This empathy across time is one of the most important empathies we can develop. It's also one of the most challenging. It's easier to empathize with people we can see and hear. But perhaps our greatest moral challenge is learning to empathize with people we will never meet, in times we will never see, and to let that empathy shape our choices today. The somatic experience of empathy. Empathy is not just a mental or emotional phenomenon. It is a full-body experience. When you genuinely empathize with someone, your nervous system responds. Your heart rate changes. Your breathing synchronizes. Your muscles might tense or relax. You might feel tears arising. Your whole being is involved in the empathic encounter. This somatic dimension of empathy is important because it means that genuine empathy requires vulnerability. You can't empathize while remaining completely defended or braced. You have to let the other person's experience affect your body. You have to let your armor down. This is why empathy can feel risky. It asks us to be touched by the world, rather than remaining untouched and therefore safe. But this somatic openness is also what makes empathy so effective. When empathy is primarily intellectual, when you understand someone's experience logically, but your body remains unaffected, the empathy lacks power. The other person can often sense this. They can feel that you're thinking about their experience, rather than actually being affected by it. But when your whole being is engaged, when your nervous system is actually resonating with theirs, they feel genuinely met. They feel truly understood. This is why therapists and counselors often talk about the importance of somatic attunement, the capacity to sense into another person's nervous system state, and to allow your own nervous process, the system, to calibrate in response. A good therapist isn't detached. Their nervous system is responsive to the client's nervous system. If the client is anxious and the therapist remains perfectly calm, there's a mismatch. But if the therapist can allow themselves to be affected, to feel some resonance with the client's state, while maintaining enough regulation to not be overwhelmed, something powerful happens. The client feels understood, not just intellectually, but in their bones. This somatic truth about empathy also means that taking care of our own bodies is essential for our capacity to empathize. If we are running on empty, if we are not sleeping, if we are in constant stress, our nervous systems don't have the flexibility to be truly responsive to others. We become defended and withdrawn. We lose access to the empathic parts of ourselves. This is why self-care is not selfish when you're in a role that requires empathy. Maintaining your own nervous system health allows you to be more genuinely available to others. The mystery of empathic accuracy. One of the more surprising findings from empathy research is that empathic accuracy, the ability to correctly understand what someone else is thinking or feeling, is not uniformly distributed and is not always correlated with the belief that you understand someone well. Sometimes people are very confident in their understanding of another person, but are actually quite inaccurate. Sometimes people are quietly uncertain but very accurate. Empathic accuracy is related to several factors. It's related to how much attention you pay to subtle cues, the way someone's voice changes, the micro-expressions that flash across their face. It's related to your knowledge of that person's history and baseline. It's related to how similar the other person's experience is to experiences you've had yourself. But it's also related to something more mysterious, a kind of intuitive resonance that some people seem to have more readily than others. Some people are what researchers call empathically gifted. They seem to have an almost preternatural ability to sense what others are feeling or thinking. They notice things about people that others miss. They can walk into a room and sense the emotional tone. They can look at someone and somehow know what they need. These people often become counselors, artists, activists, or spiritual teachers. They become the people whom others seek out when they need to be understood. Yet, empathic giftedness is not an unambiguous blessing. Empathically gifted people often struggle with what is called emotional burden because they are so sensitive to the emotional states of others. They absorb those states. They carry the weight of others' feelings alongside their own. Without proper boundaries and self-care, they can become overwhelmed. They can lose track of where others' feelings end and their own begin. They can spend their whole lives taking on others' pain without learning to prioritize their own well-being. But more importantly, empathic accuracy is not the same as empathy. You can be very accurate in understanding what someone is feeling or thinking without actually caring about them or having compassion for them. In fact, abusers are often very accurate in their understanding of their victims' inner lives. They have studied their victims carefully. They know exactly what will hurt them, what will confuse them, what will make them compliant. This accuracy of understanding combined with an intent to harm is one of the most dangerous combinations in human psychology. Real empathy requires not just accuracy of understanding, but also genuine care and goodwill. It requires wanting well for the other person, not just understanding them. This is why it's possible to be a very perceptive person who reads people well but lacks genuine empathy, and why it's possible to be someone who is not always accurate in reading others but has deep, genuine care for their well-being. Both matter. Both contribute to the quality of relationships and to the health of communities. The contagion of empathy and its counterpart. Just as we can spread anxiety or anger through emotional contagion, we can spread empathy. When one person in a group demonstrates genuine care and attention to others, it tends to make others more empathic as well. This is because we learn through observation and mimicry. When we see someone extending genuine empathy, we recognize it. We feel the difference it makes, and we often feel inspired to practice it ourselves. This means that a single empathic person can significantly impact a whole system. A teacher who practices genuine empathy towards students, who sees each student as a whole person with their own struggles and gifts, changes the culture of the classroom. Students become more empathic toward each other. Bullying decreases. Academic performance often improves. The students carry this capacity for empathy into future relationships and communities. One empathic teacher can ripple forward through decades. Similarly, one leader who practices genuine empathy toward their team, who asks about people's lives, who takes their concerns seriously, who treats them with dignity, shifts the entire culture of the organization. People are more engaged, more creative, more loyal. They treat customers and colleagues with more respect. Productivity actually increases, counter to the assumption that empathy is soft and weak. The reverse is also true. When empathy is absent, when people are treated as objects or obstacles, the emotional tone of a place becomes darker. People become more defensive. They become less willing to take risks, less creative, less engaged. They treat each other poorly as a reflection of how they're being treated. The absence of empathy spreads just as quickly as its presence. This is why creating cultures of empathy is not a luxury or a nice to have. It is foundational to healthy systems. Whether we're talking about families, schools, organizations, or societies, the presence or absence of empathy determines the quality of life within that system. Creating the conditions for empathy to flourish, modeling it, rewarding it, making space for it, teaching it, is one of the most important work that can be done in any human system. How empathy shifts over the lifespan. Our capacity for empathy and the ways we express it change significantly over the course of our lives. Young children begin to develop empathy around the age of 2 or 3, when they first recognize that others have feelings separate from their own. But this early empathy is often limited. They might offer comfort to someone who is crying, but they might offer comfort in ways that reflect what they themselves would find comforting, rather than what the other person actually needs. A 2-year-old might offer their own favorite toy to someone who is sad, not yet understanding that what comforts them might not comfort someone else. As children develop, their empathy becomes more sophisticated. They develop what psychologists call theory of mind, the understanding that other people have thoughts, feelings, and beliefs that might be different from their own. They develop the capacity to imagine alternative perspectives. By the time they reach middle childhood, most children can genuinely understand that what might seem funny to them might be hurtful to someone else. They can recognize injustice and feel moved to correct it. During adolescence, empathy often expands dramatically. Teenagers become acutely aware of others' perceptions of them, which sometimes makes them less empathic in the moment. But they also develop the capacity for abstract empathy. They can empathize with people in other countries, other times, fictional characters, causes larger than themselves. The scope of moral concern widens during this period. In early adulthood, empathy often becomes more grounded. People start to understand the complexities and ambiguities of real-world situations. They develop the capacity to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously. They often begin to practice what we might call mature empathy, the ability to understand someone's experience while still maintaining appropriate boundaries and recognition of your own needs and values. In middle adulthood, many people experience a deepening of empathy, particularly if they have experienced significant life challenges. Parents develop profound empathy for their own children, and often through that experience, develop deeper empathy for other people's children and for the vulnerability of all young people. People who have experienced loss develop empathy for others experiencing loss. People who have struggled financially develop empathy for others in financial struggle. Life experience tends to expand the scope of empathy. In later adulthood, many people report a softening of empathy, a kind of universal compassion. With decades of experience of the human condition, with the knowledge that their own time is finite, many older people develop a kind of equanimous empathy. They are less personally threatened by others' differences. They are more able to forgive. They have less investment in being right, and more interest in understanding and connection. But this is not a universal trajectory. Some people become harder and less empathic as they age. Some remain stuck in adolescent empathy for their entire lives. Some experience trauma that significantly reduces their empathic capacity. The development of empathy is not automatic or inevitable. It requires certain conditions, certain supports, certain choices made throughout life. The way empathy functions across cultures. While empathy appears to be a universal human capacity, the way it is expressed and valued differs significantly across cultures. In some cultures, empathy toward one's in-group is highly valued, while empathy extended to outsiders is viewed with suspicion. In other cultures, universal empathy toward all humans is an ideal. In some cultures, emotional expression of empathy is valued, while in others, quiet presence and practical support demonstrate empathy. These cultural differences are not superior or inferior to each other. They reflect different values and priorities that have developed in response to different environments and historical circumstances. In environments where group survival depended on strong in-group cohesion and solidarity against external threats, high within-group empathy and lower out-group empathy were adaptive. In environments where cooperation across diverse groups was necessary for survival, universal empathy was adaptive. Understanding these cultural differences is important because it allows us to recognize empathy in its various forms. We might not recognize it as empathy if it's expressed differently than we expect. A person from a culture where empathy is expressed primarily through action rather than words might be doing very empathic things without saying many words about it. A person from a culture where family loyalty is paramount might be demonstrating deep empathy toward their family members in ways that might not be extended to strangers. At the same time, acknowledging cultural differences in empathy expression doesn't mean abandoning universal ethical commitments. We can recognize that different cultures have different values and norms, while still maintaining that certain things, like the recognition that all humans have inherent worth and that suffering matters, are important across cultures. The expansion of our capacity to empathize across cultural boundaries is particularly important in our increasingly interconnected world. We encounter people from different cultures regularly, through direct interaction and through media. Learning to recognize empathy across cultural differences, learning to empathize with people from very different backgrounds, is a crucial skill for navigating contemporary life. The relationship between empathy and justice. One of the most important and most complicated questions is the relationship between empathy and justice. On the surface, they seem aligned. If we genuinely empathize with those who are suffering injustice, shouldn't we be moved to correct that injustice? Shouldn't empathy naturally lead to justice? In practice, the relationship is more complex. Empathy can motivate justice. The person who truly empathizes with those who are suffering injustice often becomes an advocate for change. But empathy can also sometimes undermine justice. If empathy is focused on understanding the perpetrator's perspective and experiences, it might lead to insufficient accountability. If empathy is selective, extended towards some victims but not others, it can perpetuate injustice. There is also a question of whether justice requires empathy at all. Some argue that justice should be based on principles and rights that exist independent of whether we feel empathy for those involved. A person might deserve justice, even if we find it difficult to empathize with them. Conversely, a person might be someone we naturally empathize with, but that empathy should not prevent us from holding them accountable when they cause harm. This suggests that while empathy can support justice, it cannot be the only basis for justice. We need empathy to keep us connected to the human reality of abstract issues. We need empathy to expand our moral concern. But we also need principles. We need systems. We need structures that ensure justice is carried out fairly and consistently, even in cases where empathy might point us in different directions. The most sophisticated approach to justice likely involves both empathy and principle. We empathize with those who are suffering to understand the reality of injustice, but we base our response to injustice on principles of fairness, rights, and human dignity, not on empathy alone. We empathize with those who have caused harm to understand their own humanity and the conditions that shape them, but we still hold them accountable according to established standards of justice, not allowing empathy to excuse harm. The sacred nature of being truly known. There is something profound and sacred about being truly known by another person. In a world that often teaches us to hide ourselves, to present a curated version of who we are, to maintain distance from others, being truly known feels almost transgressive. It is rare. When it happens, it is precious. Being truly known means being seen in your fullness, your gifts and your limitations, your strengths and your vulnerabilities, your hopes and your fears, your beauty and your brokenness. It means having someone witness all of this and choose not to reject you but to remain. It means experiencing yourself through the eyes of another who has seen all of you and still values you. This experience of being truly known is deeply healing. It counters the shame and self-rejection that so many people carry. It confirms that you are acceptable as you are, not as you think you need to be worthy of love or respect. It allows you to relax into your own skin. You no longer need to perform. You can be. The reciprocal experience of truly knowing another person is equally profound. When you truly know another person, when you hold in your awareness their particular way of being in the world, their specific struggles, their unique way of loving you, are changed. You become bigger, more capable of understanding, more compassionate. You see the world through their eyes as well as your own. This mutual knowing is the basis of the deepest forms of human connection. The parent who truly knows their child, the partner who truly knows their beloved, the friend who truly knows their friend, the therapist who truly knows their client. In these relationships, empathy reaches its fullest expression. There is understanding on both sides. There is safety. There is the kind of love that asks nothing but presence. The way grief and empathy are connected. Grief is one of the most empathy-generating experiences a person can have. When you lose someone you love, you become acutely aware of how fragile life is, how unpredictable, how finite. You become aware of how little time we have with each other. And this awareness often extends outward. The parent who has lost a child becomes more empathic toward all parents and all children. The person who has lost their partner becomes more aware of the preciousness of love and partnership in all its forms. Grief also teaches empathy because it teaches humility. The grieving person often feels isolated in their pain, believing their loss is incomparable, that no one could possibly understand. But gradually, as they receive support from others, as they learn the stories of others' losses, they recognize that loss is universal. Everyone grieves. Everyone knows this pain. In this recognition, a profound empathy can emerge. The ability to grieve is also dependent on the capacity for empathy. If you cannot empathize with the humanity of someone, truly recognize them as a full person with their own inner world, you cannot truly grieve their loss. You might experience shock or disruption at their absence, but the deep grief that comes from recognizing the loss of a unique and irreplaceable person requires empathy. This connection between grief and empathy is why societies that suppress grief often show weakened empathic capacity. When people are discouraged from grieving, from feeling their losses deeply, they often become more defended, more isolated, less able to connect genuinely with others. Creating space for grief allowing people to feel their losses, supporting them through the process, is actually supporting the development of their empathic capacity, the quiet empathy of presence. Not all empathy is expressed through words or obvious gestures. Sometimes the most powerful empathy is the simple empathy of presence. Being with someone in their difficulty without trying to fix it, without trying to make them feel better, without trying to rush them through it, simply being there. A parent sitting with their child while the child cries about heartbreak is practicing empathy through presence. The parent is not trying to convince the child that the heartbreak isn't real or that they'll feel better soon. The parent is simply witnessing the child's pain and communicating through their presence that the child is not alone in it. A friend sitting with their friend who has received a terminal diagnosis is practicing empathy through presence. The friend is not offering false hope or trying to problem solve their way out of the situation. The friend is simply acknowledging that this is real and hard and that the friend matters. This quiet empathy of presence is actually quite countercultural in our current world. We are taught to be productive, to be solution-oriented, to move quickly through difficult emotions and get back to normal. We are uncomfortable with not knowing, with powerlessness, with situations that cannot be fixed. But sometimes the most empathic response to another person's difficulty is not to fix it, but to be present with it. This kind of presence requires restraint on the part of the empathizer. It requires resisting the urge to make it better or make it different. It requires tolerating your own discomfort with the situation. But this restraint is actually what makes the presence powerful. Because the suffering person is not receiving the message that their experience is inconvenient or uncomfortable or that they need to get over it. They are receiving the message that they matter, that their experience is witnessed, that they are not alone. The empathy that bridges political divides. In our current age of deep political polarization, perhaps one of the most important forms of empathy is the willingness to try to understand those whose political beliefs are very different from our own. This is not easy. It requires setting aside defensiveness, setting aside the certainty that we are right and they are wrong, and genuinely trying to understand how they came to their positions. When we do this, we often discover that the people on the other side of political divides are not evil or stupid. They are people who have had different experiences, who have been exposed to different information, who hold different values, who have different priorities. They are trying to make sense of the world the best way they can, just like we are. This doesn't mean agreeing with them. It doesn't mean compromising on our values or our commitment to justice. But it means recognizing their humanity. It means understanding that reasonable, intelligent, well-meaning people can come to very different political conclusions. And it means that if we want to communicate with them, if we want any possibility of shifting their views, we first need to understand where they're coming from. Political change often requires this kind of empathic bridge building. The most successful social movements in history have been those that managed to empathize with those in power enough to communicate effectively with them, while also maintaining their own moral clarity about the injustice they were opposing. The civil rights movement, for example, was successful in part because many of its leaders practiced empathy toward white people, while refusing to accept racism. They helped white people understand the humanity of black people without requiring black people to accept ongoing oppression. This kind of strategic empathy that serves a larger goal of justice and change is sophisticated and difficult. It requires holding multiple truths simultaneously, that the other person has humanity that deserves recognition, and that their actions or beliefs cause harm, that we want to connect with them, and that we won't compromise on what we know to be right. This holding of complexity is one of the marks of mature empathy. The way empathy expands with practice. Like any capacity, Empathy can be strengthened through practice. Regular engagement in empathic activities, deep listening, voluntary work with people different from yourself, reading literature that offers windows into other perspectives, meditation and mindfulness practices that increase present moment awareness and connection all serve to strengthen empathic capacity. People who practice meditation often report increased empathy. This is because meditation strengthens attention and awareness. It helps people notice subtle cues they might otherwise miss. It helps people stay present rather than being lost in their own thoughts and reactions. It creates a kind of mental space in which genuine connection becomes possible. Volunteering with people who are experiencing hardship also strengthens empathy. When you spend time with people whose lives are very different from your own, when you witness their struggles and their strengths, your capacity for empathy expands. You can't maintain stereotypes when you're actually in relationship with real people. You can't remain unaffected when you're witnessing human struggle and resilience up close. Reading fiction and other narrative arts strengthens empathy as well. When you inhabit the consciousness of a character, when you see the world through their eyes, when you follow their emotional journey, you are actually training your empathic capacity. This is why avid readers often score higher on tests of empathy and theory of mind. Travel, when it involves genuine encounter rather than tourism, also strengthens empathy. When you spend time in a place, when you learn its history, when you talk with people who live there, when you experience both the beauty and the difficulty of a place, you develop deeper empathy for its people. These practices, meditation, volunteering, reading, travel, are not luxuries. They are training grounds for empathy. In a world facing deep challenges that require us to understand and care about people and places far from ourselves, investing in these practices is crucial. The empathy that exists between parents and children. One of the earliest and most powerful forms of empathy is the empathy that exists between parents and children. From the moment a child is born, a parent is faced with a mystery. What does this small person need? What are they feeling? How can I help them? Attuned parenting requires constant empathy. The parent watches the baby's cues, learns their different cries, recognizes when the baby is hungry versus tired versus overwhelmed. The parent is constantly asking, what does this child need in this moment? The parent is practicing empathy continuously. As the child grows, this empathic attunement continues. The parent of a toddler is trying to understand what is driving the behavior. Is the child tired, hungry, overstimulated, seeking connection? The parent who can empathically attune to the child's actual needs, rather than assuming or reacting to surface behavior, creates a secure foundation for the child's development. But this empathy is reciprocal. As children grow, they begin to empathize with their parents. They learn to read their parents' mood. They notice when their parent is stressed and begin to adjust their behavior accordingly. In healthy families, this remains bounded. Children should not have to take care of their parents' emotions, but some version of it is normal. A teenager notices their parent is sad and feels moved to do something to help. This empathy goes both ways. This reciprocal empathy between parents and children is one of the foundations of healthy family functioning. When empathy flows both ways, when each person is trying to understand and care for the others, family bonds are strong. When empathy flows only one direction or is absent altogether, families struggle. The courage of vulnerability in empathic connection. Genuine empathic connection requires vulnerability. You must let the other person affect you. You must be willing to be moved, to be changed, to have your certainties shaken. This is risky. It makes you vulnerable to pain. This is why many people construct defenses against empathy. If you don't let others affect you, you can't be hurt by them. If you don't open yourself to understanding their perspectives, You don't have to question your own certainties. If you maintain distance, you remain safe. But the safety is purchased at the cost of connection. This is why the capacity for empathy is also the capacity for courage. To empathize requires courage. It requires deciding that connection matters more than safety. It requires being willing to be wrong, to be challenged, to have your worldview expanded. It requires trusting that this vulnerability will not destroy you, that opening your heart will not render you incapable of functioning. And in fact, this is what the research shows. People who are more empathic, despite being more vulnerable to pain, actually report higher life satisfaction, better mental health, and stronger relationships. The courage to empathize is rewarded with deeper connection and greater meaning. The safety of isolation is purchased at the cost of these goods. This means that developing courage is part of developing empathy. The courage to be affected by others. The courage to care about people and things outside your control. The courage to be changed by connection. This courage is not the absence of fear. It is the willingness to act despite fear, to open despite risk, to connect despite uncertainty. The way empathy can heal ancestral wounds. There is increasing recognition that trauma can be transmitted across generations. A person whose parents or ancestors experienced severe trauma may carry the imprint of that trauma in their own nervous system, even if they did not directly experience it. But the reverse is also true. Healing can be transmitted across generations. When a person does the work of healing, whether through therapy, through spiritual practice, through connection with supportive community, they are not only healing themselves, they are healing the line. They are changing what they pass on to their descendants. They are interrupting cycles of pain and creating the possibility for something different. Empathy plays a crucial role in this intergenerational healing. When a person empathizes with their ancestors, when they try to understand what their grandparents or great-grandparents faced, the constraints they operated under, the pain they carried, they often can release some of the judgment or burden they've been carrying. They can hold both the reality of what happened and the humanity of the people who experienced it, and passed on what they could. Similarly, when a person becomes conscious of the effects of transgenerational trauma and works to heal it, they are practicing a kind of empathy toward their descendants. They are recognizing that future generations are real people who will inherit what they pass on. They are taking responsibility for interrupting patterns and creating something different. This empathy, across time and generations, is one of the most powerful forms of empathy. It is not just about understanding and connecting with people in the present. It is about recognizing our connection to all those who came before and all who will come after. The empathy that recognizes the humanity in everyone, perhaps the most radical form of empathy, is the one that recognizes the humanity in everyone, without exception. The capacity to see the sacred, or the precious, or the irreducible worth in every single human being, including those who have caused harm, including those whose beliefs we find abhorrent, including those who have hurt us. This is not a common form of empathy, and it is sometimes misunderstood. It does not mean excusing harm or accepting injustice. It does not mean that we should allow people to hurt us or others, but it means recognizing that even the person causing harm is human, that they have their own consciousness, their own inner life, their own history that shaped them, that they are not evil incarnate, but are a person who has made harmful choices, who is operating with whatever level of consciousness and capacity they currently have. This universal empathy is practiced by many spiritual traditions and is considered a mark of spiritual maturation. It is also practiced by some of the most effective social workers, therapists, and activists. The capacity to see humanity in everyone, while still maintaining clear boundaries about what behaviors are acceptable, is extraordinarily powerful. This kind of empathy does not come easily to most of us. It requires letting go of the comfort of seeing the world in terms of good people and bad people. It requires recognizing the complexity and the degree to which circumstances, upbringing, and conditions shape everyone. But when this empathy is cultivated, it often results in greater wisdom, greater effectiveness at creating change, and greater peace within oneself. The empathy that allows us to grieve what we disagree with. One of the more complex forms of empathy is the capacity to grieve losses associated with changes we believe are necessary and right. For example, you might believe that certain industries need to be fundamentally transformed for environmental reasons, but this transformation will result in the loss of livelihoods for people in those industries. The capacity to empathize with what those people will lose, while still believing that the change is necessary, requires a particular kind of sophistication. This empathy does not weaken your commitment to the change, but it does allow you to acknowledge the real cost of that change to real people. It allows you to work toward transition in ways that honor those costs, that support people in adapting, that don't simply dismiss their losses as deserved or unimportant. This kind of empathy is particularly important in contexts where significant social change is necessary. The capacity to hold both a clear commitment to justice and an empathic awareness of what change will cost people is what allows transitions to be made with some degree of grace and possibility for integration rather than bitterness and can please. Resistance. The simple empathy of asking and listening. Sometimes the most profound empathy requires nothing more than asking someone, "How are you?" and actually listening for the real answer. This simple practice, done genuinely and repeatedly, can transform relationships and communities. Most of the time, when people ask, "How are you?" they are not expecting or inviting a real answer. The greeting is a social convention. People are expected to respond, "Good, how are you?" and move on. The question is not actually seeking connection. It is maintaining a polite distance. But what if you asked, "How are you?" and actually waited for an answer? What if you listened to what someone was really experiencing, rather than looking for an opportunity to talk about yourself? What if you asked follow-up questions that showed genuine interest? What if you occasionally asked, "Is there anything you need?" or "What can I do to support you?" This simple practice, multiplied across relationships and communities, could transform the quality of human connection. Most people are not receiving this kind of genuine attention. They are moving through their days, managing their difficulties alone, not talking about what's really going on in their inner worlds. One person who regularly asks and listens can change this for those around them. The empathy that holds hope. One of the most important forms of empathy is the empathy that holds hope, while also acknowledging difficulty. The capacity to see someone's current struggle without reducing them to that struggle. The capacity to know someone is hurting while also believing they can heal. The capacity to acknowledge the injustice in a situation while still believing change is possible. This hopeful empathy is different from false positivity or toxic optimism. It doesn't deny the reality of the difficulty, but it holds the possibility of something different alongside the reality of what currently is. It provides support, not by pretending things are fine, but by witnessing what is while also reflecting back the other person's capacity to endure, to adapt, to survive, and eventually to thrive. People often need this kind of empathy. They need to know that someone sees how hard things are for them, but they also need to know that someone believes in their ability to get through this. They need someone who can hold both truths at once. The way empathy connects us to all living beings. While most of our discussion has focused on empathy between humans, many people experience empathy toward animals and toward the natural world. This empathy is not less valid than empathy toward humans. It is the same capacity. extended beyond our own species. Some people cannot watch animals suffer without feeling it. They feel empathy for animals in labs, animals in factory farms, wild animals losing habitat. This empathy is what motivates vegetarianism or veganism, what motivates conservation efforts, what motivates advocacy for animal welfare. And this empathy, like all empathy, is a form of genuine connection across difference. Similarly, some people feel empathy toward forests, toward oceans, toward ecosystems. They grieve the loss of species, the destruction of habitats. They feel the interconnection between all living things. This empathy is what motivates environmental activism and conservation efforts. These forms of empathy toward animals and toward the natural world are increasingly important as we face ecological crises. The capacity to feel genuine care for beings and systems that are not human, that cannot speak for themselves, that cannot offer us anything material in return, is crucial for our survival as a species. If we can only empathize with what directly affects humans, we will continue to damage the living systems that we depend on. The empathy that transforms into love. As empathy deepens and continues, it sometimes transforms into love. Not romantic love necessarily, though it can be that, but love in the sense of a commitment to the other person's well-being that goes beyond what rationality would suggest. Love that shows up, that keeps trying, that forgives, that remains present even when it would be easier to leave. This love arises from empathy. When you have truly known someone, when you have understood them, when you have been understood by them, the experience of love naturally follows. Love is empathy, deepened and solidified. It is empathy that has decided to stay. This love is what allows families to endure difficulty, what allows partners to remain committed through hardship, what allows friends to support each other over decades, what allows teachers and social workers to remain in their roles despite exhaustion and heartbreak. The empathy transforms into love, and the love sustains them. The empathy that exists beneath conflict. Even in the midst of deep conflict, empathy is possible. In fact, in conflict, empathy is most needed and most difficult. When people feel attacked or misunderstood, when tensions are high, the tendency is to retreat into us versus them thinking, to caricature the other side, to refuse to understand them because understanding might weaken our resolve. But some of the most powerful moments of reconciliation occur when one person chooses, in the midst of conflict, to empathize with the other side, to try to understand them, not to agree with them, but to understand them. This choice often shifts something in the dynamic. It opens up the possibility of genuine dialogue rather than simple opposition. This is why many conflict resolution processes include the practice of each side stating the other side's position back to them, to the satisfaction of the other side. It requires each person to truly understand the other's perspective well enough to articulate it, and something shifts in people when they do this. They become slightly less certain, slightly more curious, slightly more aware of the other's humanity. The empathy that asks what we owe each other. Ultimately, empathy raises the question, what do we owe each other? If I truly empathize with another person's experience, if I recognize their consciousness, their capacity to suffer, their inherent worth, what obligation does that create for me? Different ethical frameworks answer this question differently. Some argue that empathy creates strong obligations. We should structure our societies to prioritize the well-being of those who are suffering. Some argue for more moderate obligations. We should help those we can help, but we cannot be responsible for solving all suffering. Some argue that empathy creates no direct obligation, that we can understand someone's suffering without being required to fix it. These are important questions without easy answers. But what seems clear is that genuine empathy creates some shift in us. It cannot leave us exactly as we were. It asks something of us, even if we're not certain what. It opens a question that we cannot unopen. Once we truly empathize with another person's struggle, once we truly understand them, we cannot simply return to a state of complete indifference. This is why empathy is sometimes resisted. People sense that empathy asks something of them. If they truly acknowledge the suffering of others, if they truly empathize, they will be changed. They will have to reconsider their choices. They might have to live with some degree of discomfort or guilt. It is easier to maintain distance, to refuse empathy, to tell ourselves that others' suffering is not our problem. But the opposite is also true. Many people find that engaging in empathy, despite or because of what it asks of them, gives their life meaning and purpose. The commitment to understanding others, to reducing suffering where possible, to working toward more just systems, provides a sense of purpose that purely self-directed living does not. The empathy transforms lives not just of those who receive it, but of those who practice it. The empathy that allows for self-compassion. One of the most underestimated forms of empathy is empathy directed toward oneself. Many people are willing to extend empathy toward others, but are harsh and judgmental toward themselves. They demand of themselves what they would never demand of anyone else. They criticize themselves for perceived failures in ways they would never criticize a friend. But genuine empathy must include the self. If you cannot empathize with your own struggles, your own limitations, your own humanity, your empathy toward others will have a brittle quality. You will extend empathy to others while secretly believing that they are weak or broken, and simultaneously believing this about yourself. Self-compassion and empathy toward others develop together. As you learn to be gentle with yourself, to acknowledge your own struggles without judgment, to recognize that your limitations are part of being human, you develop greater capacity to extend the same grace to others. Conversely, as you develop empathy toward others, you often find it easier to extend that same empathy back toward yourself. This self-empathy is not self-indulgence. It's not about making excuses for harmful behavior or avoiding accountability. It's about recognizing your own consciousness, your own capacity to suffer, your own inherent worth as a person doing your best, with the resources and consciousness you currently have. It's about being on your own side, while also trying to become better. The way empathy can bridge our loneliness. One of the paradoxes of our current age is that we are more connected than ever through technology, yet more lonely than ever. We have hundreds of online connections, yet sometimes lack even one person who truly knows us. This loneliness is not just unpleasant, it is actively damaging to our health. Genuine, empathic connection is the antidote to this loneliness. Not the shallow connection of social media, but real meeting, real presence, real understanding. When someone truly listens to you, truly tries to understand you, truly sees you, something shifts. The loneliness that no amount of online connection can touch begins to ease. This is why practices that build empathic connection, community gatherings, support groups, therapy, meaningful friendships, are so valuable. They provide what social media cannot: genuine meeting, the experience of being truly known by another human being. And this works both ways. When you practice empathy toward others, when you truly listen to them, when you truly try to understand them, you also address your own loneliness. You move out of isolation into connection. You become part of a web of understanding and care. You discover that you are not alone in your experience, because you are actively meeting others in their experience. The empathy of small acts. We often think of empathy as a grand gesture or a profound understanding. But empathy is also found in small acts. The friend who remembers you mentioned you were stressed and checks in. The coworker who brings you coffee because they noticed you looked tired. The stranger who holds the door or helps carry groceries. The person who notices you're quiet and asks if you're okay. These small acts of empathy are easy to dismiss as insignificant, but accumulated over time, they create the texture of human kindness that makes life bearable and often beautiful. They are also practice. Each small act of empathy strengthens the capacity. Each moment of attention to another person's well-being trains the nervous system in connection. In a world that often feels dark, these small acts of empathy are points of light. They remind us that people care about each other. They remind us of our common humanity. They restore hope, and they ripple outward in ways we will never fully know. Someone receives a small act of empathy and is moved to practice empathy towards someone else. The kindness travels forward through time and space, touching people we will never meet. The empathy that exists in grief rituals. Throughout human history and across cultures, grief rituals have been spaces where empathy is practiced and held. Whether it's a funeral, a wake, a sitting shiva, a Day of the Dead celebration, these rituals create space for grief to be witnessed and supported. In these rituals, empathy is both given and received. Those attending are practicing empathy toward the grieving person. They are saying, "Your loss matters. It is real. You are not alone." And the grieving person is receiving empathy, being held by their community in their pain. There is also often empathy extended toward the person who died, remembrance that honors them as a specific, irreplaceable individual who mattered. The loss of these rituals in modern secular culture has left many people isolated in their grief. When someone dies or when we experience significant loss, we are often expected to move on relatively quickly. We are not given adequate space to grieve. We do not have rituals that gather people around us in our pain. This lack of rituals, this lack of empathic holding of grief, is one of the reasons so many people struggle with unprocessed loss. Creating new rituals or reclaiming older ones that allow for genuine empathic witnessing of grief is part of cultural healing. It is recognizing that we need each other, especially in our most difficult moments. It is practicing empathy at the communal level, weaving together as a group to support those among us who are suffering. The empathy of teaching and learning education at its best is an empathic encounter. A good teacher does not simply transmit information. A good teacher is trying to understand how a particular student thinks, what confuses them, what excites them, what they need to understand something. A good teacher practices empathy constantly. Similarly, a good student practices empathy toward the material they are learning. They try to understand not just the facts, but the reasoning behind them. They try to understand the perspective of the people who created the knowledge they're learning. They are practicing empathy in the act of learning. This empathic dimension of education is often lost in systems focused on standardized testing and memorization. But when education becomes empathic, when it is about genuine meeting between teacher and student, when it is about understanding rather than simply absorbing information, it becomes transformative. It changes both the teacher and the student. The empathy that sustains long-term relationships, whether marriages, deep friendships, or family bonds, are sustained by ongoing empathy. The capacity to continue to know your partner or friend as they change and grow. The willingness to continue to try to understand them, even when they frustrate you or you disagree. In long relationships, empathy requires ongoing practice. It would be easy to feel like you already know your partner completely, to stop paying attention, to relate to them based on habit and assumption, rather than on who they actually are in the present moment. But real relationships require continued empathy. They require continuing to be curious about the other person, continuing to ask questions, continuing to try to understand them. Relationships fail not always because people stop loving each other, but because they stop empathizing. They stop trying to understand each other. They fall into patterns of assumption and reaction. The empathy that initially brought them together gets replaced by routine or resentment. Reviving relationships often requires reviving empathy, going back to asking each other questions, trying to understand each other's inner worlds again, being curious about each other, being willing to be changed by what you learn. When couples do this work in therapy or on their own, relationships often dramatically improve. The empathy, renewed, breathes life back into connection that had become stale. The empathy that recognizes interdependence. One of the deepest insights that empathy can bring is the recognition that we are not separate, autonomous individuals. We are fundamentally interdependent. We depend on each other for survival, for meaning, for sanity, for love. In cultures that emphasize independence and self-reliance, this recognition can feel like a loss. But it is actually a liberation. When you recognize your interdependence, when you practice empathy toward all those you depend on and all those who depend on you, you begin to see yourself as part of a web of relationships. You see how your choices affect others. You see how others' choices affect you. This recognition naturally leads to greater care. If you genuinely recognize that you are dependent on farmers and truck drivers and grocery store workers, that your health depends on doctors and nurses, that your safety depends on firefighters and police, that your happiness depends on friends and family, you naturally want to treat those people well. You naturally want systems to exist that support those who support you. This empathic recognition of interdependence is what makes cooperation possible. It is what allows humans to live in groups and societies. It is foundational to civilization. We cooperate because we recognize that we need each other, that our fates are intertwined, that the well-being of the group is inseparable from our own well-being. The empathy that allows for forgiveness. Forgiveness is often misunderstood as a weakness or as excusing harm, but genuine forgiveness is actually a sophisticated act of empathy. It requires understanding how the person who harmed you came to cause that harm. It requires recognizing their humanity, even in their wrongdoing. It requires deciding that your own freedom and peace matter more than your grievance. This doesn't mean there should be no consequences for harm. Justice and accountability are important. But forgiveness is something beyond that. It is releasing the grip that anger and resentment have on your own nervous system. It is deciding not to be defined by what was done to you. Forgiveness is possible when we can empathize with the person who hurt us, without excusing what they did. When we can understand that they were probably doing the best they could with the consciousness and resources they had. When we can recognize that they are human, flawed, and struggling, just like everyone else. This kind of empathy and forgiveness doesn't always come easily. Sometimes it requires years of processing. Sometimes it requires professional help, but when it does come, it is profoundly freeing. The person who forgives is liberated from the weight of carrying resentment. The way empathy transforms into action, empathy that remains only in the realm of feeling, without translating into action, is sometimes called empathy that doesn't go anywhere. To be moved by someone's suffering, but to do nothing about it is incomplete empathy. Real empathy, when it is genuine, tends to want to move into the world. It wants to help. It wants to make things better. This is why empathy is the foundation of activism and social change. People don't usually work for social justice because they intellectually believe it is right. though that helps. They usually work because they have empathized with those who are suffering injustice. They have heard their stories. They have imagined what it would be like to be in their position, and that empathy has moved them to action. The most effective social movements have been led by people who have deep empathy for those they are trying to help. The activists who fought for civil rights, for labor protections, for women's rights, for environmental protection, for disability rights, they were moved by empathy. They had connected with the humanity of those being harmed, and that connection moved them to act. This translation of empathy into action is important because it prevents empathy from becoming complacency. It is possible to feel sad about someone's suffering while doing nothing to address it. But when empathy translates into action, when people organize and work and sacrifice to create change, then empathy becomes a force that actually transforms the world. The empathy of presence in shared suffering. Sometimes empathy doesn't require words or actions. It requires simply showing up, being present with someone in their suffering. Sitting with someone who is going through something terrible, not trying to fix it or make it better, just being there. A parent sitting with their child through a nightmare. A friend sitting with their friend who has received devastating news. A community gathering after tragedy. In these moments, empathy is expressed through presence, through the simple act of saying, "You are not alone in this. I am here. Your suffering matters to me." This kind of presence is powerful because it breaks the isolation that so often accompanies suffering. When you are going through something terrible, you often feel completely alone, like no one could possibly understand, like no one cares. The presence of someone who shows up, who sits with you, who witnesses your pain, changes something. It doesn't fix the problem, but it makes the problem more bearable. The empathy that sees potential in others. One of the most beautiful forms of empathy is the empathy that sees potential in others. The teacher who believes in a student who doesn't believe in themselves. The parent who recognizes a child's gifts and nurtures them. The friend who sees what you could become and encourages you toward it. This empathy is not naive. It doesn't ignore reality or pretend that everything is possible, but it recognizes that people are not fixed in who they currently are. They have capacity for growth, for change, for becoming more fully themselves. It recognizes the person's potential and reflects it back to them. This kind of empathy is particularly powerful for people who have been told they are not capable, not smart, not worthy. To have someone believe in your potential when you don't believe in it yourself can literally change the trajectory of your life. You start to see yourself through their eyes. You start to believe you might be capable of more. The empathy that connects us to beauty. Empathy is not only about connection in suffering or difficulty. It is also about connection in beauty and joy. When you truly empathize with another person's joy. When you genuinely celebrate their happiness. When you allow their good fortune to move you. That is empathy too. Many people find this harder than empathizing with suffering. There is a tendency to feel envious or resentful when others experience what we haven't experienced, to diminish their joy, to feel less bad about our lack. But genuine empathy includes the capacity to genuinely celebrate with others, to be glad for them, to feel their happiness. This empathy extends to beauty as well. The capacity to stand with someone before something beautiful, a sunset, a piece of art, a moment of grace, and to sense that their experience of beauty is similar to yours, even if unique. To recognize that we are having similar experiences of awe or wonder. This empathy of shared beauty and joy creates bonds just as real as empathy of shared suffering. It reminds us that we are connected not just in our vulnerability, but in our capacity for appreciation, for wonder, for delight. The empathy of storytelling. One of the most ancient and most powerful forms of empathy is storytelling. Humans have told stories for as long as we have had language, and stories are how we practice empathy. Through stories, we inhabit consciousness other than our own. We see the world through different eyes. We understand motivations and perspectives we might not otherwise understand. The power of storytelling to create empathy is why literature matters, why film matters, why theater matters, why personal narratives matter. Through these stories, we develop empathy. We expand our understanding of what it means to be human. We recognize ourselves in people radically different from us. This is why censoring stories, banning books, controlling narratives is so dangerous. When only certain stories are told, only certain perspectives are available for empathic connection. When we limit the stories being told, we limit people's capacity to empathize beyond their own narrow experience. Conversely, increasing access to diverse stories increases empathic capacity. When more people have access to stories from different cultures, different time periods, different experiences, they develop more sophisticated empathy. They understand more possibilities of human experience. The empathy that holds both truth and compassion. In our polarized times, we often face a false choice between truth and compassion. We believe we have to choose between being truthful about harm and being compassionate toward those who caused it. But real empathy holds both. You can be truthful about injustice while also maintaining empathy for the perpetrator. You can be clear about accountability while also recognizing the perpetrator's humanity. You can demand change while also being open to the perpetrator's capacity for growth and redemption. This, both divided by and thinking, is sophisticated and difficult. It would be easier to be purely angry and blame-focused, or purely compassionate and overlook harm. But the integration of both truth and compassion is what allows for genuine healing and growth. The empathy that develops through crisis. Often, the deepest empathy develops not through study or good intentions, but through lived experience of crisis. The parent of a child with mental illness develops empathy for all parents of children with mental illness. The person who has experienced homelessness develops empathy for all homeless people. The person who has been seriously ill develops empathy for all seriously ill people. These experiences of crisis can be transformative. They strip away assumptions. They make the abstract concrete. They create genuine understanding that no amount of intellectual study could create, and they often move people toward action. The parent of a child with mental illness often becomes an advocate for mental health services. The formerly homeless person often works to end homelessness. The person who has been ill often becomes a caregiver or works in healthcare. This is not to romanticize suffering. We do not need to experience every form of suffering to develop empathy. But it is to recognize that sometimes our greatest teachers are our own difficulties. They teach us empathy. They teach us compassion. They teach us our connection to others, the empathy that asks us to imagine differently. Perhaps the most important empathy for our current moment is the empathy that asks us to imagine different futures, to imagine what it would be like to live in a world with greater justice, greater sustainability, greater peace, to empathize with future generations who will inherit what we create, to ask ourselves what world we want to leave for them. This empathic imagination is what drives innovation and progress. It is what motivates people to work toward change, even when that change is difficult or costly. It is the capacity to care about people we will never meet, to recognize their worth as equal to our own, to make choices today that honor their futures. The end and the beginning. As we have journeyed through these many dimensions of empathy, perhaps what becomes clear is that empathy is not a single thing. It is a vast capacity that humans possess for connection, for understanding, for caring about others. It is expressed in infinite ways. It develops differently in different people. It is shaped by culture and experience and choice. But underlying all these expressions is something fundamental: the recognition that other people exist, that they have inner lives as rich and complex as our own, that their suffering matters, that their joy matters, that they deserve to be understood and cared for. This recognition, when it truly lands, changes everything. It changes how we treat people. It changes what we believe is possible. It changes what we are willing to work for. It changes who we become. The empathy we practice today creates ripples that extend far into the future. The person we listen to with full presence might listen to someone else with that same presence. The kindness we extend to someone might be extended by them to someone we will never meet. The understanding we offer might open someone to understanding others. The empathy travels forward through time, creating connections we will never see, touching lives we will never know. And so, dear listener, as you rest with these reflections, consider the empathy in your own life. Consider where you have felt truly understood and how it changed you. Consider where you have been able to understand another person and how it changed them. Consider what might shift if you practiced empathy more fully, more consistently, more bravely. Consider that every conversation is an opportunity for empathy. Every encounter with another person is a chance to practice understanding. Every moment offers the possibility of genuine connection, and these connections, multiplied across countless moments and countless people, create the fabric that holds us all. The empathy that exists all around us, often invisible, often unnoticed, is what keeps the world from falling apart. It is what allows us to trust each other. It is what allows us to work together. It is what allows us to love. It is what makes life worth living. As you close your eyes and allow sleep to come, rest in the knowledge that you are connected to others, that you matter to someone, that someone's understanding and care extends to you, and that you have the capacity to extend that same understanding and care to others. You have within you the power to see and to be seen, to understand and to be understood, to care and to be cared for. Let that truth settle into your bones. Let it soothe your nervous system. Let it carry you toward rest. Breathe deeply, knowing that you are part of a vast web of human connection, that you belong, that your presence matters, that the empathy you extend and receive is not just individual kindness, but the very fabric of what holds us together as a species. Sleep now, if you are ready. Drift into the quiet, knowing that others are sleeping too, all across the world, all connected in our shared humanity, our shared capacity for empathy, our shared longing for understanding and connection. And when you wake, remember what it feels like to be truly understood. Remember what it feels like to truly understand, and carry that memory into your next encounter with another person. Let empathy guide you. Let it lead you toward greater understanding, greater compassion, greater connection. The world needs your empathy. It needs the specific, unique way that you are capable of understanding and caring. It needs you to see people. It needs you to listen. It needs you to recognize the humanity in everyone you meet. So be brave enough to empathize. Be brave enough to care. Be brave enough to be moved by others' suffering and joy. Be brave enough to let your heart be touched by the world. This is the work of being human. This is the great practice, and in practicing it, we heal ourselves and each other, and, in small ways, we heal the world. Good night. May you rest well, held in the understanding that you are not alone, that you have been understood and will be understood again, that your capacity to understand others is one of your greatest gifts, and that the empathy you offer, no matter how small, matters more than you can know. Sleep now, dear listener. Sleep in the peace that comes from knowing you are part of something larger than yourself. You are part of humanity. You are part of the great web of empathic connection that spans all times and all places. You are home.